Okay, so I'm very happy to introduce Heather Stewart and very grateful that she has agreed to lead our conversation today. Dr. Stewart is assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy here at OSU. Her primary areas of research include applied ethics, bioethics, and the ethics of artificial intelligence, philosophy of medicine, feminist philosophy, and the philosophy of language. They co authored the book Microaggressions in Medicine, published in 2024. Another strand of Dr. Stewart's research focuses on algorithmic injustice and how AI systems and algorithms can reinforce various forms of social and epistemic injustice. She was also a fellow in the Humanities Research Group Fellowship Program in 2022 and 23. This group focused on the risks and opportunities of ChatGPT. So she has definitely been working on some of these things for a while. And a quick word about the form of our event today. So Dr. Stewart is going to start with a brief presentation, followed by some pre-prepared questions. After that, we have an exercise to collect thoughts from those of you in attendance through breakout rooms and a discussion. The first part of the meeting will be recorded and available by request. So we're not going to post it or anything, but we can provide it. So if you know anyone who couldn't be here today, tell them to reach out to me. I'm happy to share it. But the second part, we are not going to record. Okay, and with that, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Stewart.
Okay, I'm going to get my screen shared here. One moment. Okay, can you see that okay? Okay. 1 second here. Okay, perfect. So hello, everyone. First of all, I want to thank everyone for being here today and to especially thank Dr. Jennifer Borland for the opportunity to be part of this important series that brings a humanities focus to critically important conversations about artificial intelligence and the implications of artificial intelligence to our lives, careers, relationships, and so on. So to get us started today, I'm going to give a brief presentation, which I'm calling Resisting Two Common Narratives About AI, Thinking Seriously About the Role of AI Ethics in the Humanities Today. And I should say at the outset that this isn't like a typical research talk that the academics in the room will be used to, but rather I'm thinking of this as an opportunity to offer a sort of overview of some issues that I think are important at the intersection of ethics and AI, and sort of a snapshot of the kinds of things I think we should be thinking seriously about when it comes to the ethics of AI technologies and the somewhat fast and perhaps at times uncritical adoption of these technologies in various settings, including but not limited to the one we're all in currently, higher education. So I want to take a look at some things that I think should be on our collective radar in this moment. And additionally, I want to use this opportunity to invite some thinking about ways we might push back on the trend towards what I take to be, again, a somewhat uncritical acceptance of, or at least hesitance to challenge, the infiltration of AI into more and more dimensions and aspects of our lives, perhaps especially those aspects of our lives that are really core to what it means to be and to thrive as a human being. So things like critical thinking, argumentation, creativity, imagination, emotional and intimate connection with other human beings and animals and the environment, and all of those kind of things that make us who we are. So we in the humanities, or we who have interest in the humanities, or we who have a desire to protect what it means to be human, which I assume or hope is everyone on this Zoom call, have an opportunity and maybe perhaps a moral obligation to think seriously about what kinds of things we need to try to insulate or protect from this trend towards AI and everything. Or perhaps what we might need to sort of reclaim or take back from AI, and how we can think critically about or resist some of the common narratives that are used to convince us that this is all normal and okay, or even inevitable, and that we should accept or embrace that this is our future. This is how we're doing higher education. This is how we're doing human relationships, and so on. So with all of that said, I'm going to turn to a moment to these two common narratives about AI that I think are kind of operating in the backdrop. Okay, so the two narratives that I want to think a little bit about are the following. So narrative one, the narrative that says that AI is no different than a calculator, and narrative two, which says that AI is inevitable. So I'm going to take these narratives in turn. So the first narrative that AI is no different than a calculator, the gist is the following, right? So you'll hear people say something like AI is just a tool, right? We've adapted to the use of all kinds of other tools, even in the face of moral panic around them, and this is no different, right? It's a tool, we'll adapt to it, and what matters is simply how we use it, something like that. Okay. I know this is a lot of text, I'm sorry. But here's some reasons among many why I take this narrative to be misleading or problematic. So I think in thinking about the idea that AI is just like the calculator, we should step back and think a little bit about the way that these things differ, right? We need to think about the function of these respective tools, the scope of what they can and can't do, how they operate, the nature of how they operate, and who and what is served by their use. So I just want to flag again some key differences. I don't think this is an exhaustive list, but some things that I think are significantly different between a tool like a calculator, perhaps especially a calculator in this case, and artificial intelligence technologies. So one, a calculator is designed to yield a single objective answer or output on the basis of the inputs, right? The results of putting an equation into a calculator are constrained in important ways. And it's going to give the same result to myself and you if we put the same equation in the calculator. AI, on the other hand, right, will not produce the same output every time. Different users may get different results based on the same or very similar inputs, or the same user might get different results at different times. So that's one sort of key difference just in how these tools are working and what they're doing. Relatedly, a calculator does not hallucinate or make up false information, or to use a philosophical term here, produce bullshit, right? Content that has no bearing on the truth, while AI does all of those things. A calculator, importantly, is not drawing on historically biased input data and therefore reproducing certain kinds of bias, but AI is. If I use a calculator to do some mathematical equation, while I might not be able to explain how the calculator arrived at its answer, right? Someone can. Perhaps I could go to my colleagues in math and they could explain to me the nature of how the calculator went from the input equation to its output. This is radically unlike AI, right? Where AI faces this kind of black box problem in which even AI developers or programmers often lose sight of or don't understand how AI is generating certain predictions or outputs or how it's arriving at the answers that it's offering. So that too is an important difference in the kind of explainability of the outputs of these tools. Just a few more important differences that I think that kind of help us dismantle this narrative. The uses of calculators are, of course, much narrower and don't threaten to become what the phrase some people use for AI as an autocomplete for life. Whereas people are using AI to make decisions about virtually every aspect of their life, virtually every important decision and perhaps less important decisions that they might make in a day, from where they might go to eat with their friends or what recipe to make for dinner, to who they might date, and so on, right? So more and more outsourcing of a far wider range of our thinking goes into AI tools than the sort of narrower use of a calculator. And while it's true, and perhaps we have good reason to care about this, that over-reliance on the calculator might weaken some particular cognitive skills or a narrower range of cognitive skills, like the ability to do mental math or the ability to understand math in a deeper way. Over-reliance on AI threatens to degrade cognitive skills in a far more sweeping and universal way, right? Degrading things like our ability to read and write and engage in critical thinking far more broadly. And I think that's worth being concerned about. And lastly, while the calculator introduced changes in how we teach and learn and do math in our daily lives, and I'm sure my friends in the math department don't love that, AI, on the other hand, threatens to change everything, right? To be extremely disruptive in the labor force, in the economy, in our political systems, in our environment, in human relations, and more. Turn slide. So the upshot is that The significance of AI in our lives is far more sweeping than the significance of the calculator or other tools like it. And I think comparisons like this, right, this refrain that we always hear that AI is just like the calculator, is really reductive about the broad significance of AI, perhaps by design, but that might be the sort of cynic in me. And I think that kind of narrative plays a role in obscuring the very real and widespread risk of AI and making us a lot more comfortable with its use than we might otherwise be. Okay, so turning to narrative two, the narrative that AI is inevitable. Okay, so the gist of this kind of narrative, you'll hear people say things like, well, when it comes to AI, right, the cat's already out of the bag, so to speak. AI is this unstoppable force. The ball's already rolling, however you want to put that. And it's better to get on board, to hop on the train, or get left behind, right? For all of us in the humanities, right? For our careers to be obsolete. So if we don't want our fields in philosophy and literature and art and so on to become obsolete, then we better just force AI into our teaching and resource, right? Okay, so that's kind of the gist of this second narrative that I want to think about. And I think there's an underlying assumption of this narrative that, again, that AI is this unstoppable force, and more importantly, that we lack agency to do anything about it, right? That we lack agency to decide otherwise, to decide to change course in some important way. But I think it's worth thinking about how this narrative has been marketed to us by particular people for particular reasons. And I'm thinking specifically here of those who stand to profit from the integration of AI into, well, everything. Pursuing the integration of AI into every aspect of our lives, from education to criminal justice to healthcare to warfare to our interpersonal relationships and so on, is a social and political choice made on the basis of values. It is not a foregone conclusion in all contexts and cases. And we could, I think, collectively decide that there are some things, some aspects of our lives that we want to or ought to, or in fact do, value more than, say, profit and technological advancement at any cost. And these might be things like human emotion and connection and empathy and creativity and authenticity and so on. So before accepting this narrative that AI is inevitable and therefore we all just sort of have to hop on board, I think we should think critically about who this narrative serves and who stands to gain and what they stand to gain from selling the idea that we need or should want AI in every aspect of our lives, right? And why would that be? Well, because it's a quick and efficient shortcut. It saves us the trouble of doing the work of thinking and reading and writing and exploring and discovering and so on. And we should think about what is lost when this narrative is embraced. And we should recognize that things could be otherwise, right? How these technologies are developed and implemented, and the extent to which they're embraced, and in what context, are all choices that are made on the basis of values. And so I kind of want us to all think about the idea that we do have agency here, that we could choose to reject AI in certain contexts, to push for regulation of AI and its use, either that be at the institutional level, in our places of employment, which I assume for many of us is here at Oklahoma State University, to push for regulation more broadly outside of our institution and so on, or to seek to reshape when and how it's being used instead of simply, right, accepting this idea that we've been told that it's an unstoppable, inevitable force. So uncritical acceptance of the narrative that AI is inevitable in all contexts, everywhere, all the time, leads us to behave as if that's already true, when we could instead be thinking seriously about ways to insulate and protect what we value. So I kind of want to put forward the idea that AI is not, in fact, an inevitable conclusion in education, in art, in how we interact with other human beings, and how we understand ourselves. I think we need to tell a different story about what we value that resists or push back on that narrative. And I think the humanities has a critical role to play in that project. So the claim here is that the uncritical embrace of this kind of narrative, or both narratives, the calculator and the inevitability narrative, obscures serious ethical issues with AI. And so I'm just flagging a couple of these here in the interest of time. I can't go into all of these or any of these in any real depth. But I think in embracing the sort of calculator type narrative, we obscure some important ethical issues, such as the role of bias in underlying AI systems, right? The idea that AI is trained on biased data and as a result yields biased outputs, which can be incredibly high stakes when AI is being used in hiring context, in medical diagnosis, right? In decisions in criminal justice and policing context, and so on. I think the idea that it's just a tool and that it's doing something similar to what a calculator does obscures the issue of AI generated misinformation that I think we ought to care about, and the way that AI also circulates and amplifies misinformation on social media and otherwise. And also the issue of privacy, right? Engaging with AI is a lot different than engaging with a calculator for reasons of data collection, privacy, and so on, right? How much of our data and information we're giving up in interacting with AI systems, and how much control we're losing over who we are. Okay. In embracing narrative two, this narrative of inevitability, I think we obscure ethical issues such as the real risk to the future of labor and the economy, right? So we're treating it as inevitable that AI is going to enter into a lot of our work and labor context without thinking seriously about the implications of that and what those shifts might mean for people. I think we're not thinking seriously enough about risk to the environment. I think we're not thinking seriously enough about the loss of creativity and what's specifically significant about the act of creation and making art for human beings in a flourishing human life. And I think the risk of outsourcing human emotions and connections to AI is also something that we're not taking seriously enough when we're thinking that AI is inevitable. Okay. In accepting that AI, right, is just a tool and that its widespread adoption is a foregone conclusion, I don't think we're allowing ourselves the time and space to consider these risks and whether we're willing to take them on in exchange for the apparent value that AI offers or may offer. But again, these are choices, right? And we need to consider all of the risk and benefits in order to make those choices in an informed way. So I want to take a moment to just offer one example here of infinitely many examples that I could give to highlight the idea that there are choices to be made here, and that those choices are deeply rooted in values. And as I was thinking about this presentation, this one just fell into my lap yesterday. So maybe some of you have seen this and maybe some of you have not, but here we are. So perhaps some people saw yesterday that First Lady Melania Trump waltzed into this education and technology event with this humanoid here. And she encouraged attendees and those listening to envision a future in which a quote, robot philosopher educated their children from their homes. How lovely a future, right? We can all sit at home and be educated by robot philosophers. So Melania Trump says, quote, imagine a humanoid educator named Plato. Access to the classical studies is now instantaneous. Literature, science, art, philosophy, mathematics, and history, humanity's entire corpus of information is available in the comfort of your home. So as a human philosopher, selfishly, of course, I don't want to be put out of a job by Plato here. But my qualms and discomfort with imagining this kind of future for our children, for my child, run much deeper. So among all the things I worry about here are a few. I worry about when we think about moving toward this kind of future, being okay with it moving toward this kind of future, taking it as inevitable that we move toward this kind of future. I worry about the interpersonal aspects of things like education and the role educators play in socializing our children to be humans. I worry about the bonds with other children and the rich experiences students have in physical schools with other people. I worry about the safety and love that some students need and seek and receive in those kinds of settings. I worry about who controls the information that AI-enabled robot educators would be trained on and the inherent gaps and biases that they would have and reproduce. I worry about what we're teaching our children to perceive as normal, and what we're teaching them should be embraced, right? Perhaps if something like a future where they don't even need to leave their homes and engage in collective endeavors of learning and play and imagination. and in the having of shared social experiences. But instead, they can try to have all of these needs met or perhaps replaced by AI systems and robotics. So I take that as, again, a reflection of this idea that these are choices and they're choices rooted in values. So I urge all of us to consider that future, that one version of a future, one vision of a future that's on offer in that kind of case is not inevitable, not yet anyway. And so I think we can choose to pursue a different kind of future. But doing so involves deciding what we value and committing to holding on to it, right? Even when the powers that be and people with certain kinds of interest tell us that this is inevitable and that we ought to fall in line and embrace it. So thank you for the opportunity to share some initial thoughts, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion. Okay, let me stop share quickly. Okay.
Okay. Hello again, everyone. I have a couple of quick sort of follow-up questions for Heather, and then we are going to move on to part two, where we think about how we collectively can come up with some ideas about specifically how the humanities might play a role in articulating some of these values that Dr. Stewart explored. But I wanted to maybe kind of build on your presentation a little bit and ask you a couple more questions before we move on. And so one question I had was, so I think you did a wonderful job of articulating some of the broad ethical issues. And I was curious if you could talk a little bit more about what you think the most significant ethical issues are, specifically in relation to the speedy adoption of AI in higher education. So I don't know if you have some additional thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, there are many, right? Some of them, like you said, kind of came up in the presentation. I think a big one is the very real and I think very serious risk of weakening or losing skills that are important, not only in higher education, but like in every aspect of life, including the aspect of life that is going to be figuring out how to navigate life alongside of AI, right? So, for example, if we're outsourcing the task in education that we tend to use to try to cultivate and build things like critical thinking skills to AI, then we weaken those critical thinking skills at a time when those critical thinking skills are like needed in a really like dire way, right? So, I think, for example, about how significant strong critical thinking skills are for trying to navigate a world that is filled with AI generated misinformation and where we're all engaging, or maybe many of us, or perhaps most of us, are engaging on social media platforms where AI plays a role in amplifying misinformation, right? So I think now more than ever, the skills that we're supposed to be cultivating in higher education, things like critical thinking and digital literacy and those kind of things, they're essential, right, to helping students, helping all of us cultivate and develop the kind of discernment that we need to know what is real and what isn't, and who to trust and who to believe. And so yeah, I think when we like allow, or in some cases even encourage, the use of tools that are inherently at odds with the development of those skills, I think we're doing a real disservice to the students who need them more than ever, perhaps, in this kind of environment. So I think critical
Yeah, and
thinking.
that Yeah, absolutely. And I think also that leads into my next question, which is specifically about the ethical responsibilities of faculty and instructors, and what those responsibilities might be in relation to their students who might be experiencing AI in different aspects of their education. So yeah, kind of thinking about um, as instructors, what are our ethical obligations and responsibilities in this context?
Yeah. I think I could go in a lot of different directions here. So, but I think I'm going to take the like least popular route. And this may not be an answer that everyone in the room loves, but I think as faculty, people who in the room who are faculty, especially faculty in the humanities, I think we have a responsibility to teach the content for which we are trained experts, and to not shortchange students out of the opportunities to learn about things like philosophy in my case, or history and the arts and so on, from experts trained in those areas, simply because those faculty are feeling pressured to try to use their time and energy to bring AI into everything, even when they're not really like qualified to do that in a way that's responsible and informed or helpful. Right. So, first and foremost, I think we have a duty to our students to try to give them rich experiences of engaging with the kinds of content that we are trained to teach them well, right? So maybe we have something like a duty to try to inspire interest and excitement in our students about the things that we obviously think are valuable enough to dedicate our lives to researching, right? Whether that's logic or poetry or music or whatever it is, right? Not to communicate to them even implicitly that all that matters to their lives and futures is how well they can use AI tools or incorporate AI tools into every aspect of their lives. Um, and I should say, related to that, that I think there's this trend in higher education to kind of accept this narrative, parts of which are true, but this narrative that says, look, future employers want their future employees, their students, to be well versed in AI. So, like, we all have some role or responsibility in training them to use AI well, or to try to fit AI into everything. And I just think that's a misguided approach. I think there are a lot of things that employers might want or desire in our students, and that perhaps it's not everyone's job to teach all of them, right? There are lots of skills that might be beneficial to students in their future careers that I am not personally equipped to teach them, and that it's not my responsibility to teach them. There are also all kinds of life skills that students need to be successful adults, right? They need to know how to write a check for their rent to their landlord. They need to know how to file taxes and so on. Uh, and it would be a real disservice to them if I used the time in a philosophy classroom that might be the only time they get to spend studying philosophy and developing the skills that I think philosophy can help them learn, trying to teach them all of these other things that they may need in their life. So I say that to say, like, it may be true that employers in many contexts have some desire for future employees who have some awareness of or ability to engage with AI. And I don't think it follows from that that it's all of our job to therefore put AI into everything we do all of the time. One, because we won't do that well, and two, because it takes time away from giving students real opportunities to learn about other things that are of value, right? Of poetry and music and philosophy and history and all of these other things. So, yeah, I think the long and short of it is that we have a responsibility to our students to give them rich experiences that aren't reduced to AI.
Thank you very much. I have, depending on where we land with time, maybe one more question, and then we might move on to our next part of the event. But I wanted to see, I know this is something that you touched on in your presentation as well, but what kind of specific aspects of the arts and humanities you think we should be kind of most worried about being undermined via AI?
Mm. So at risk for sounding some combination of dramatic or alarmist, and maybe I'm both of those things to some extent. But I think if things are like continue to proceed as they're going, unchecked and with sort of a lot of complicity and not a lot of pushback, I think all of them. I think we run the risk of letting most of the things that we value in the humanities as researchers and educators in the humanities. So things like art and aesthetic experiences and critical thinking and human connection. I think we run the risk of allowing all of those things or significant portions of all of those things to be outsourced to AI, and for that to become and accepted as normal or inevitable, right? Uh, and so I think that should lead us to think that there's real reason to try to figure out what it is we really value in the humanities. Like, why do we think a humanities education is important? Why do we think the kind of things we do and teach within the humanities are important? And to try to communicate that value to our students, right? Students don't necessarily know when they get here why reading certain kinds of literature is important, or why an awareness of history is important, or whatever it may be, why studying philosophy is important. And if we don't do a good job of communicating those things to them, why wouldn't they look for shortcuts, right? Why wouldn't they uh, outsource those opportunities to AI? And so I think, right, then the sort of burden is on us to try to do a better job of thinking seriously about why these things matter, and how do we communicate that value to our students. But I think if we don't do that well, then we really do risk sort of losing all of it, really, losing a lot of things of value as a result. So now that's not like a particularly optimistic or cheery answer, but hopefully one that comes with a bit of motivation for all of us who are in the humanities to think about why the things we do matter and how to get a lot better at communicating that value to others.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's a great segue to kind of part two of our event, where I think we would love to have these groups talk a little bit about what they think the humanities can offer this bigger conversation, and also maybe how we articulate what those values are, and then find strategies for advocating for the value of the humanities. So this is the juncture at which I'm going to stop recording. And again, if you're watching this video and you want to follow up and find out what some of the group ideas were, you can drop me an email and I will be happy to share those with you at some point. But we wanted to make sure people had feeling that they could be kind of fully honest in their conversations. And so, okay, we're going to stop recording now.